Thank you all very much indeed for participating in this Transparency Task Force event. As you know, the title of the event is "How should the finance sector in Australia be reformed?" That's a question we pose not just of Australia, but of other countries too. It's obviously an issue that is at the heart of many of the social, societal problems around the world. We, the Transparency Task Force, what are we? Some of you are quite new to the Transparency Task Force, so I'm going to spend a moment explaining a little bit about ourselves and talking you through some of the types of activities that we get involved with. We are a UK-based organisation. Our status is that of what we call a certified social enterprise. What that essentially means is that we exist to create an impact as opposed to creating profit. So we're all about trying to make a difference. To be a bit more precise than that, the Transparency Task Force is all about driving a particular agenda. And our agenda is to promote ongoing reform of the financial services sector so that it supports society and serves society better. That is what we are all about. Our long-term vision, ladies and gentlemen, is to build a highly respected, and for me personally, those two words are very, very important, a highly respected international institution that is dedicated to helping ensure that consumers are treated fairly by the financial sector. We think there is a mountain of evidence to indicate that over the years that simply has not been done. We are absolutely sure that there's a huge scope for improvement in terms of the way that the financial services sector operates. And what we're trying to do is just add a bit of weight as a counterbalance to the very, very powerful lobbying forces and forces of that influence the way the financial system works. And quite frankly, we're finding ourselves spending more and more of our time and energy trying to get regulators to regulate in a more effective way. Because we are not owned or controlled by any other organization, and because we do not operate on a sponsorship model, we are completely free to do what we want and say what we want. And we do say and do quite a bit. So for those of you that don't know the Transparency Task Force, I think it's fair to say that we are pretty much an up and atom kind of organization that speaks truth to power as we need to. I'm going to share my screen and just walk you through one or two things before we move on and go to our first speaker. So let me go to that now. So this is the Transparency Task Force International Initiative. We internationalized the Transparency Task Force in 2019. And in practical terms, what that meant was that we run events in Dublin, Amsterdam, Zurich, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Washington, DC, New York, and Boston. And we also, I'm very pleased to say, we also managed to run 2 events in Australia, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne. Now, the net result of all that activity is that of the approximately 4,000 members that we have in our network around the world, approximately 1,500 are outside the UK. And those folk are organized into their respective areas. So, for example, we have TTF USA, we have TTF Asia, Europe, Australia, and also Canada and Africa. Canada and Africa are pretty small. There's a lot of traction with our work in Australia, I think mostly because of all the publicity and all the issues around the Hain Commission. Europe's quite big for us, USA is quite big for us, and so too is Asia. The next thing I'm going to share with you is the fact that we have approximately 400 what we call ambassadors around the world. So the ambassadors of the Transparency Task Force are people who feel particularly strongly aligned to our pro-consumer reform agenda, people who are fans of the idea that there ought to be greater levels of transparency and truthfulness and trustworthiness in the financial sector around the world. So we have ambassadors in 21 countries, including, as you can see, Australia. And I'm going to quickly show you what we've got going on in Australia in terms of our ambassador network. I won't go through each person, obviously, but you can see here we've got quite a few people who are part of the ambassador network in Australia. We're always on the lookout for more. We're looking for people who are genuinely aligned to a pro-consumer perspective, want the system to change, and I'm pleased to see that we have, many of our ambassadors here with us today. You'll no doubt be hearing from some of those ladies and gentlemen during the session as we go through. I'm just going to work my way down to the bottom of this whilst chatting away. In a moment, I'm going to talk to you about the work that we do in relation to our consultation responses and our white papers and that kind of thing. We also spend a lot of time and energy engaging with the media. We believe it's very, very important to harness the awesome power of the media and raise awareness of particular issues. And there are, of course, many, many issues that need to be raised when it comes to the ongoing workings of the financial services sector. We're nearly at the bottom of this list. As I say, we do have about 400 ambassadors around the world on that network, and that number is growing all the time. The next thing I'm going to show you is our consultation responses. When the consultation happens, we reach out for volunteers and we work together as a team to put in a consultation response. 2021 has been a phenomenally busy year for us in terms of consultation responses. We've never been so busy. If you compare, for example, 2021 with previous years, here's 2020, here's 2019, here's 2018, 17, and 16 and 15, you'll see that 2021 has been a remarkably busy year. And I think that's for one reason and one reason alone. The financial services sector is wrestling with its own transformation. And because of that, there's a lot of consultation activity going on. This third one down from the top, this is the Transparency Task Force response to the ASIC consultation on promoting access to affordable advice for consumers. That was the very first consultation response we produced, ladies and gentlemen, that was outside the UK. And we're eager to do more work like this for Australia and for other non-UK countries. As well as consultations, we produce white papers. Here's some we did in 2018, 17. We're partway through our first one relating to Australia. This is not finished yet, but it's a work in progress and we're almost completed. As you can see, it's about Australia. It's about Australia's superannuation system, and it's essentially a cluster of ideas that we've gathered from some of our members, some of who are here today, people like Darren McShane and David Knox and Nicholas Morris and Giles and Ian Fryer, etc. There's many, many others. I won't go through that in any detail. We are probably going to be completing that within the next 4 or 5 weeks. And if you have an interest in having your thoughts about how the superannuation system in Australia could and should be improved, then you're very, very welcome to get involved with it. I'm going to be putting a link during the course of today's event into the chat to all of the web pages I'm showing you, and we will be circulating the chat after today's session, so you'll have a record of it. We are always on the lookout for people who want to volunteer and help. So here's our staff. We also have some interns who've previously worked with us. We have some people at universities who are doing bits and bobs for us as well. But everybody else on the rest of this page is a Transparency Task Force volunteer. And quite literally, some of our volunteers spend just 1 hour a month doing something helpful and useful for the Transparency Task Force. Others spend a great deal longer than that because they want to. Obviously, people only volunteer their time if they want to do it. And I think it's fair to say that our cause is a cause that is being seen to be both noble and necessary. So many people, not just in the UK, but around the world, really do identify with the idea that we need to shake the financial services sector into shape. And that, yes, of course, whilst it ultimately might be the responsibility of the regulators, we as citizens of our various countries can do a great deal by working together to actually drive the kind of positive and progressive and excuse me, purposeful reform that is needed. So of course, it would be great if you were to become a volunteer if you're not one already. We have a very, very weak financial model. It's a subscription model. We would encourage as many of our members as possible to become subscription members. There's a great deal of flexibility in the way that that works. So I actively encourage you all, please, to become a subscription member. And of course, we pretty much rely on donations as well. So that would be good. Later on in the session, if we have time, I'm going to be talking about this violation tracker. I won't do it now because we're going to move on into the rest of our program. But just before we pass over to our first speaker, does anybody have any questions or comments about the Transparency Task Force before we do dive in? In a moment, we're going to be going to Dr. Andy Schmulow, and then we'll be going to our second speaker, Bernard Thomson. But before we go to Andy Schmulow, does anybody have any questions or comments about the Transparency Task Force before we jump into the session? Just wave a hand at me if you do. Otherwise, it looks like everyone's good to go. Great. My final comment is, remember, we are recording the session. We'll edit it up and we'll circulate it in a few days' time. Please do feel free to use the chat to circulate thoughts, ideas, comments, questions that you have. And of course, you are welcome to raise awareness of yourself by way of your contact details, LinkedIn profile, etc., if you'd like to. I would also, please, final point before we pass on to Dr. Schmulow, I would encourage everybody, please, to turn your cameras on. Let's try to make this as close to a real life live experience as we possibly can. But that's enough from me. Hope you enjoy this session. I hope we're able to have a candid but constructive conversation about the changes that need to happen within the financial sector in Australia. I don't think there's anything particularly unique about the issues that Australia faces, but I think it is fair to say that there are lots of things happening down under that ought to be discussed and debated further in a free and open way. And to kick that process off, let's now please warmly welcome Dr. Schmulow to take centre stage, so to speak, and go for it. So, Andy, over to you. Thank you very much. Can we please show our appreciation to Dr. Schmulow?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. The pleasure's all mine. I hope you can hear me okay.
Perfectly well, yeah.
So Andy asked me to give a bit of an insight into where the legislative changes in Australia are headed. Commissioner Hayne made a couple of findings about our legislative regime. He said that our legislative regime was too prescriptive, too rules-based, inadequately normative, and as a result, very difficult to enforce. And that's been the experience with countries all over the world. A very prescriptive, very rules-based legislative regime is problematic in the financial industry because very prescriptive regimes tend to regulate things in such a way that the financial industry in particular is able to arbitrage its way around those regulations. And part of the reason why it's so prevalent in the financial industry and so easy for the financial industry to arbitrage its way around the regulations is because the financial industry creates products and services which are intangible. They exist only in our minds. They are concepts, and those concepts are reinforced by contractual promises. So all you have to do is change the way you conceive something, which just means look at it from a different perspective, and there you have an opportunity to arbitrage your way around the regulations. So one of the things Commissioner Hayne said is that the Corporations Act be recognised as having failed consumers, that the legislative regime has failed to be effective, that there have been tremendous efforts that have been made to keep it effective or make it effective, all of which have failed. And those efforts can be seen in the form of a piece of legislation that's 5,000 pages long. The Australian Corporations Act is longer, I believe, than the entire Codex of Norwegian law. And every few years it gets longer. Every few years, when we find another example of how the financial industry has arbitraged its way around the regulations, our Treasury writes another couple of 100 pages of legislation. And it is just what Mr. Justice Reyes described as legislative porridge. Thousands of pages of it and all of it useless. So Commissioner Haynes said we need to start again. We need a root and branch renewal of the legislative regime. And we need to have a regime that defines norms of behavior and enforces those norms of behavior. And he said there are 6 things that the law must enliven. His 6 commandments: when acting for another, always acting in their best interests, don't mislead or deceive, etc., etc. He's got 6 of them. So those were the recommendations Commissioner Hayne made, and those recommendations were operationalized, if you like, with the Australian Law Reform Commission being convened and appointed and charged with the responsibility of providing a new legislative regime that would describe and define and then enforce norms of behavior. So the Law Reform Commission has an inquiry that's currently underway, and that inquiry seeks to create a legislative regime, as I say, that's normative and that is principles-based and outcomes determined. Now, this is a particular style of regulation. These terms, principles-based and outcomes determined, these are terms of art that have a substantial degree of scholarship and jurisprudence behind them. And the thinking is that if you define norms of behavior, you can hold a financial service provider to account according to those norms of behavior. So I put together a research cluster. One of my colleagues in that cluster is here this evening, Dr. Paul Mazzola. And we have colleagues, the Dean of Law at Griffith University and the Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Sydney, and a colleague at Queensland University of Technology, and 2 of my colleagues from Wollongong. And we are currently researching a proposal that we will put before the Law Reform Commission on creating a normative, principles-based, outcomes-determined regime. We're very fortunate. Our research is funded by the Law Reform Commission. They have provided us funding to conduct a survey of consumers, which we will do through the Australian Consumers Federation, also known as Choice, where we will be surveying potentially as many as 230,000 Australian consumers to determine what they want to see in legislation. What are the things that concern them? How do they want to see those views reflected in the legislation? And we will be partnering with FinCEA, and they will be surveying 8,000 finance professionals. And we've entered a formal partnership agreement for our research with the Law Reform Commission and with our Super Ombud, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And we will be putting together a proposal with, we hope, a strong data spine, which analyzes and critiques the normative, principles-based, outcomes-determined regimes that already exist in 2 countries. The first country where it was implemented was the United Kingdom in 2005, and the UK has 16 years of experience running a normative, principles-based, outcomes-determined regime. It's called the TCF regime, the Treating Customers Fairly regime, and it also stands on 6 pillars. It must be said, The UK's experience with TCF is mixed. I'm sure Andy will second that. It's been a mixed performance. But the reviews that have come down, like the Gloucester review and the Parker review last year, indicate that those failings in the TCF regime are as a result of poor enforcement by the regulator. There is also experience to be drawn from South Africa. South Africa copied the UK's TCF regime in 2011, and they've had 10 years of experience with it, and I must say, a much better experience. They have a very activist regulator. They have a regulator that is interventionist, proactive, preventative, seemingly not just uncaptured by the industry, but bordering on somewhat antagonistic towards the industry. So very refreshing to see. And then to try and understand, well, why has the South African regulator been so much more effective than the UK regulator? Unfortunately, the proposal that we will make to the Law Reform Commission only infers certain recommendations about the regulatory space, although we may make these expressly, which is that we need a dedicated conduct and consumer protection regulator. ASIC is a regulator of everything. They're a business name registry. They enforce the Corporations Act against all companies, not just the financial industry. So they have a remit that is too wide, and we will be recommending that ASIC's enforcement capacity be hived off into a separate standalone regulator that does nothing other than consumer protection and market conduct. Either make it standalone or make it a division within the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which has a long history of being a highly effective regulator. And so because our research answers the Law Reform Commission's brief so perfectly, a normative principles-based outcomes determined regime, well, there are two of those, TCF, UK and South Africa. They both rest on 6 pillars. Those 6 pillars map to the 6 commandments that Commissioner Hayne handed down. There is a total of 27 years worth of scholarship and experience to draw on, and evidence of how it's been operationalized. And so I think, and in addition to that, the ALRC seems to see sufficient value in our research that they've agreed to fund it. So I think there is a fairly good chance that what the ALRC will recommend when they hand down their report at the end of 2023 is a new standalone piece of legislation that is, if not expressly so in name, then certainly in spirit, based in whole or in major part on the UK TCF regime. And that will be a challenge for industry. There are challenges in knowing how to comply in a principles-based regime. It does require a shift in thinking, but the consulting work that I've done in South Africa for the last 3-4 years indicates to me that it's perfectly possible to do so. I think that's probably enough, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Schmulow. If I could ask you to comment on a couple of things specifically before we go into general Q&A and discussion. You touched on the idea that there's a big problem around the world's regulatory framework in relation to enforcement. It's one thing having rules, but it's another thing actually enforcing them properly. Could you tell everybody about from what you know, about what's been happening in the UK around our senior managers certification regime? And I'm asking you to do that because I think it is a really good example of how it's one thing having rules and regulations in place, but unless you actively enforce them, unless you're not captured and you're free to enforce, your regulatory framework is actually more like smoke and mirrors than anything else. Could you speak to that point for me, please? And then we'll go to everyone else around that would like to make a comment or ask a question. Thanks, Andy.
Andy, I'm going to decline to talk on the UK senior management regime because I think there've been some developments of late, and I'm not sure that
okay.
My knowledge is current. In terms of enforcement, so may I point out the TCF regime is not entirely separate as an issue, as a concept, as a factor. It is not entirely separate from enforcement. A very significant impetus behind the TCF regime and behind a principles-based, outcomes-determined regime is precisely to make enforcement easier. That's its raison d'etre. So the two issues are interlinked, but certainly you can have a TCF regime, a principles-based and outcomes-determined regime where the enforcement is inadequate, as has probably been the case in the United Kingdom. And of course, you can have the opposite. You can have a prescriptive rules-based regime that is very effectively enforced. And that's a very unusual state of affairs. And the example of that is the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They have a very prescriptive, very rules-based regime. Absolutely nobody tangles with the MAS, as they call it, the all-seeing eye. But most often, because a prescriptive rules-based regime bedevils enforcement, most often what you will have with a prescriptive regime is very poor enforcement. And that's what we've got in Australia. So I acknowledge that the enforcement question will be absolutely crucial for the ALRC. There has been significant development in Australia recently, the establishment of the Financial Regulator Assessment Authority. And I was pleased to be able to have a hand in that legislation. And that will act as a board of oversight over ASIC to expose, on an annual basis, expose failings by the regulator in terms of its enforcement obligations. And, you know, we had a precursor to this a couple of years ago. Professor Graham Samuel, very eminent academic and regulator in Australia. Graham Samuel was part of a Treasury capability review that was conducted of APRA, our bank regulator. And it was an eye-watering excoriation. APRA was left absolutely nowhere left to hide. And so these kinds of reports can be done. They can be highly effective, highly robust, very rigorous, and they do move the dial, because I know from people who work at APRA that a great deal of time and effort has been spent trying to remedy the observations made by the Treasury Review. I don't suggest that they are trying to remedy those observations out of the goodness of their hearts. They're trying to remedy those observations because they don't want to be told at the next review you still haven't fixed it, because then people at the top, their jobs might be in jeopardy. So these things do move the dial, and I hope that with a standalone regulator watched over by a board of oversight in the near future, I hope that we'll see some improvements.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you. In relation to SMCR, I think this is worth talking about because it really does make the point so well about it's vital that rules and regs are properly enforced. So former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney made a point many years ago that the single most important learning from the global financial crisis was that there was a lack of personal accountability for the people who did what they did. And the UK regulatory response to that learning was the development of SMCR, the Senior Managers Certification Regime, which essentially meant that if you're a senior person, in a position of influence within an organization, you personally are responsible for doing the job properly in an effective way. But it transpires that there's either been a very small number, a very, very small number of enforcements by the main UK regulator in relation to the senior manager certification regime. And everyone's got their own opinion about this. We within the Transparency Task Force generally have the view that part of the problem is regulatory capture. Our financial system in the UK is so important to us, as of course I know it is to you as well, that the powerful forces lobbying the regulators are such that they are able, it would appear, to get the regulators to pull their punches. Very, very interesting development.
Andy, may I just address a very good, very interesting question put in the chat by Dr. Turnbull?
Please do.
So Dr. Turnbull asks, how do my proposals correct the problem identified by the Hayne Commission of the problem of financial services providers possessing too much power and information over their customers? That's a very important consideration. Our Productivity Commission has described our banking industry as a cozy four-bank oligopoly, where there is a minimal degree of competition and where the policies of our bank regulator in the aftermath of the global financial crisis facilitated our four largest banks increasing their market share from something in the region of 80% to about 95%. Smaller banks can't compete because they have higher funding costs. And then on top of that, of course, they're major political donors, they're major party political donors, and a number of people in our current government are former bankers. I would say that in the long term, my answer to Dr. Turnbull, in the long term, I would say that the solution, which I'm increasingly of the view is necessary in this but also many other circumstances, is that we need to break up our big four banks. We need to have more competition in the banking industry. In the short term, how do you combat that power? Don't vote Liberal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Great point you've made there, Shan. Could I invite Harry Shime to comment and verbalise the point he put in the chat about the BEAR, which I know nothing about. I'm sure you guys do. And then we'll go to Eddie Bernstein, who wants to make a point as well. Harry, over to you, sir. Please take a moment to introduce yourself, then dive in with your point. Thank you.
Yeah, so the BEAR stands for the Bank Executive Accountability Regime. And it was actually, I think it actually preceded the Hayne Royal Commission. Perhaps, Andy, if you can confirm that.
Yes, well, they in fits and spurts and starts, they were setting it up, and then they backed off for a while, and then they gave the banks more time, and then they sort of watered down.
That's right.
But
yeah, so
the Hayne Commission.
Exactly, and I don't know whether sort of the issue got sort of confounded through Hayne, but I haven't seen any progress on it. So conceptually, it's meant, I guess, to operate like the SMCR. That there is meant to be accountability at the top. There's a designation of who is considered a senior executive for the purposes of this regime, and they supposedly are meant to be held accountable for the actions of their institutions. Hasn't quite come to pass as far as I understand it, though.
My understanding is, sorry, I shouldn't interrupt. Mr. Bernstein had his hand up.
It's okay, Andy. Finish off your point, and then we'll go to Ellie in a moment. Thank you.
My understanding is that Josh Frydenberg, our treasurer, who is one of those individuals who used to be a banker, has reduced the personal liability in the senior managers regime from $1 million per individual to 0.
Wow.
So we're back to the future. Our banking industry, the best thing that ever happened to our banking industry was COVID. Under the cover of COVID, they were able to slip the noose that had been put around them by the Hayne Royal Commission. All bets were off. All of a sudden, it was all about reflating the economy, which is code for cut regulations so banks can make more profit, and we'll do that by throwing consumers under a bus. This, by the way, for a banking industry that, as I said, the Productivity Commission has described as a four-bank oligopoly, a banking industry which is, depending on the time period you use, the most or the second most profitable banking industry in the world by ROE. So part of the reason why we've had no real wage increases in Australia in the last 15 years is because all of the gains we've made from productivity increases have just been sucked up by our banks. So they've become a parasitizing presence in our economy. Their misconduct is out of control. Nothing's changed since the Hayne Commission because our legislative regime is so difficult to enforce. And I have to say here, let me just add an insight. I'm close to one of the ASIC commissioners. I won't say which one. And he and I have very frank exchanges, and we do it in a way that it's not part of any IT platform for either of our employers, and we speak very openly. They also want to win. They also want a litigation win. And they work their butts off collecting evidence, and they collect huge amounts of evidence. Remember, pretty much all the evidence that the Hayne Commission used and all the revelations the Hayne Commission used, all of that information came from ASIC, or almost all of it came from ASIC. So they work their butts off and they present huge amounts of evidence to the DPP, and then they get a comeback from the DPP to go, it's very difficult to define this piece of legislation. We don't know whether, we're not quite sure whether we'll be able to make it stick because this is the definition of the legislation. And this commissioner's, this person is tearing their hair out. That's also part of the problem, I'm afraid. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. Ellie, please take a moment to introduce yourself and share with us your comment, your question, your point. Very pleased to hear from you, Ellie.
Hi, I'm new to this forum. So I'm a fintech lawyer, I guess you'd say, a banking and finance lawyer for my sins, and specifically looking at financial technologies, emerging technologies. So my question is on that topic, where do you see the role of decentralized finance, and can that keep sort of centralized finance honest, so to speak, in the absence of effective oversight? That's sort of one question. And more specifically, I don't know if today there was a report, the Bragg report came out. One of the recommendations is sort of a softening of the travel rule. I know we're getting a bit specific, which requires banks and crypto platforms to report on any transaction over $1,000. What's your view on the travel rule specifically, and perhaps the softening of it? So I guess question one is general about sort of crypto and DeFi as a challenge, and question two specifically on the travel rule.
Andy, I'm going to have to ask you to throw that open to the floor and see if somebody else would like to answer it. And Mr. Chimay has put his hand up. I know nothing about cryptos.
Harry knows one or two things about this area. Harry, over to you.
Yeah, one or two things about fintech. I think with DeFi and crypto more specifically, maybe let's look to what the SEC has done just this week. So the crypto industry has been pestering the SEC for about 8 years. The Winklevoss twins, who obviously were some of the pioneers in this space, or Winklevi as I like to call them. But so finally this week the SEC relented, but it relented not with an instrument that was directly attached to Bitcoin, which is what the industry wanted, but an instrument, an ETF specifically, that trades off the back of the futures market Bitcoin, which exists, I think, on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, I think. And the reason for that exactly is regulation. The SEC, therefore, through the margining provisions, has eyes in and control over the CME, its members, and then through, obviously, asset management more broadly, control over the issuers of the ETFs. So it controls both sides. Had it opted for a direct Bitcoin product, it would have lost control. It would have gone into the ether in terms of clearing of those instruments and all important custody, right? That would have been sort of outside of its regulatory reach. So, Eli, just a short, quite a long answer there, but we're not quite there yet because most regulators, most treasuries are very concerned about that. And my guess is what you will find is official cryptos issued by countries that keep it sort of within the regulatory ambit intent.
Thanks, Harry. That was really
can I just have a follow-up comment or question? Could it be that in doing so, we are sort of handicapping the only sort of true regulatory oversight, that is to say, competition, right? So banks and they might be more concerned by a threat from competition than they are by government oversight. And by making that competition harder, right, perhaps that's actually counterproductive in terms of its impact. What are your thoughts about that?
Very much a competition versus regulation issue. I guess take it to the extreme and you have potentially you're opening up a Pandora's Papers box, if you will. You know, we had the Pandora Papers come up recently, and you'll have exactly that. You'll have massive movements of currency potentially washed through these systems. So that's the whole anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing question with DeFi.
Thanks. That was a really interesting exchange. I'm going to change my view to gallery so I can see everybody. Please wave at me if you'd like to make a point at this stage, ask a question, make a comment. I'm going to invite, you've come up on the screen as Leslie, Peter, but obviously it's Peter. I'll change your name on the screen, Peter. Peter Hanlon, over to you. Please do take a moment to introduce yourself first, Peter, and then off you go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Peter Hanlon, and my background is primarily in governance and integrity within the banking sector, but a lot of interest in and quite a bit of work done in the super funds, Andy. And as you know, I'm working on an integrity governance model, which is pretty close to launch now with the system. So that's the backdrop. I just that was music to my ears. Andy. It was exactly the way that I would thought things would go if I had a command economy in front of me. A couple of things though. I was a little surprised about the principles-based being more effective to enforce, because regulators hate principles. They prefer rules. So I'm just interested that that has been an outcome of this approach. And then the other one was given my other thought on this area is basically empowering consumers literacy and also plain speak kind of disclosure. The other side of this is that going to be anywhere within the work you're doing, or is it where are you focusing primarily on the principle-based submission? Andy, but great stuff and fabulous to hear. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Would you like me to address those questions, Andy?
Yes, please. Very interesting points being raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great questions. Some regulators hate principles-based regimes because of the judgment involved. Yes, that's true. It's not the case in South Africa. I'll tell you how you get from yes, it's true to being like not the case in South Africa. People are lazy. And one of the ways in which that laziness evidences itself is people are too lazy to think for themselves. They want somebody else to come and think for them. If you're in the industry, you want somebody to come and think for you and say to you, when you advertise interest rates, this is how you've got to do the calculations, and this is what number you've got to put over here, and that's what the equal sign's got to be. This is how you do it. People love that because they don't have to think for themselves. Same with the regulators. Mm-hmm. When they're first given a principles-based regime, they run around like headless chickens going, oh my God, I've got to make a decision. I've got to make a decision whether this thing's right or wrong. And they need somebody to just take them by the hand and they go, there, you're a grown-up, you'll be fine. And then they start to learn. Then the penny drops and they start to learn and they start to go, I've seen something that's unfair. I don't need to go and look at thousands of pages of regulations, and I just need to have a good argument why this thing over here is unfair. And if I've got a good argument as to why this thing is unfair, then I can go and put that in front of the regulated entity and say, explain yourself. I'm seeing something unfair. Why is it unfair? Because here's simple logic. You know, Peter, a 6-year-old child knows the difference between fair and unfair. Mm-hmm. Case in point, the last time you gave one 6-year-old child an ice cream and not the other. They cotton on like that. If a 6-year-old child can see when something's unfair, we can see when something's unfair. We can see, for example, I take, for example, the Wye River bushfires and the response of AAMI. AAMI Insurance had done a lot of marketing around, if you have an insurance policy with us and your house burns down, we will build you a new one. Then people's houses burnt down and AAMI said, well, no, that's not what the contract says. The contract says, we'll build you a new one, or we'll give you how much money it would cost us to build you a new one. And the fact that how much it would cost us is half of what it would cost you, because we get preferential deals from builders. Well, it's in the fine print, it's in the contract. Has the consumer been treated unfairly? The answer to that question is, was the consumer told, if your house burns down, we'll build you a new one? Yes, right, they've been treated unfairly. AAMI, yeah. You don't, it's not rocket surgery. And all it takes is for regulators to get over this initial kind of sense of, oh my God, I've got to make a decision. What am I going to do? And then eventually they go, you know, we can make these decisions. And they are making them every day in South Africa. A lot of big insurers in South Africa turned around and went, COVID, no, even though it looks like that's what the contract says we'll pay out for, here's 1,000,001 reasons why we're not going to pay out. The regulator said, no, it's unfair. Here's an instruction, you've got to pay out on COVID claims. So I think that's the answer to why regulators don't like it, because they don't want to get off their proverbials. Yeah. And the next part of your question was?
Well, really just consumer kind of informed consumer empowerment and kind of plain speak disclosure and
yes.
Yeah.
Consumer literacy is immensely important. It should be encouraged and supported absolutely everywhere. Better informed consumers make better choices. All of those things are true. Mm-hmm. However, we must remember there are some forms of investment that no amount of consumer literacy will be enough to ensure that consumers can make informed decisions. Let me give you an example. Superannuation. You won't be able to analyze your superannuation completely unless you are an actuary. If you're not an actuary, then you are at some degree of vulnerability in terms of your superannuation, no matter how financially literate you are. Wow. And then on top of that, not only will you always be financially, to a degree, some degree of vulnerability in terms of your superannuation, unless you're an actuary. Not only will you always be vulnerable, but you are forced into that system by government legislation. You are pushed gently towards the turning blades. So if you're going to make superannuation compulsory for people, and you give them no choice about it, and it's a system where nobody can be fully capable of protecting their interests unless they're an actuary, then you've got to have a regulator. You've got to have a regulator that does its job and protects consumers where even the most literate cannot fully protect themselves. And in terms of plain speak disclosure, again, I use the example of South Africa. It was made legislation back in about 1994, and there are historical reasons. South Africa has a large proportion of people who are very poorly educated, some of whom have no education at all. For those people, the law is always going to be, to a degree, inaccessible. And so it was an imperative in a new democratic South Africa that every piece of legislation had to be written in plain English. And guess what? The new Conduct of Financial Institutions Act, which I had the great opportunity to be involved in the drafting, it's about 50 pages long, not 5,000. It's written in plain English. It's written in such a way that the ordinary man or ordinary woman in the street, who, by the way, the law is supposed to protect, they can pick up a copy of the law and, would you believe it, read it and understand it. Now, why can't we have that in Australia?
Wow. This is a really interesting conversation we're having. In a moment, Andy, I'm going to ask you about what happens when regulators make decisions and people start losing trust and confidence in them making the right decisions. And I'm going to bring that point to life by sharing my screen. So again, I'm talking here about the UK, but I think the principles behind what I'm saying might apply elsewhere, perhaps even in Australia. So for those that don't know, the Transparency Task Force is the secretariat to two all-party parliamentary groups in the UK. This is one of them. It's about personal banking and fairer financial services. And in December last year, the all-party parliamentary group put out a press release. It was covered quite widely. Here's one of the articles that was published. And as you can see, the title of this piece is MPs Call for Inquiry into Effectiveness of the Financial Conduct Authority. Why? Because of a long list of catastrophic regulatory failures. And to bring this point right up to date, this is something that was published yesterday in the UK press. NAO is the National Audit Office. So the National Audit Office, as its name suggests, basically keeps a check on whether the state is getting value for money on what it spends. And it's basically probing the Financial Conduct Authority's handling of a particular problem. It's the British Steel defined benefit pension transfer scandal. And the article goes on to explain why the National Audit Office is doing this. So my question to Andy is, what happens if, when the regulators appear to consistently make the wrong decisions and people start to lose trust and confidence in their ability, where will that direction of travel end up? What will happen, do you think? Any thoughts about that?
I think, Andy, we've already seen the direction of travel. A collapse in confidence in our institutions, challenges that are constantly being encouraged to the core institutions of our countries and of our democracies. These are the things that gave rise to Donald Trump.
Understood. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I know that Dr. Schmulow needs to depart shortly. Can we please show our appreciation for what I believe has been a very, very informative and thought-provoking session. Dr. Schmulow, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much. Have a good evening and stay safe and well. Thanks, Andy. Thank you. Okay. We're going to be hearing from Bernard Thomson shortly. Bernard's going to be coming at this from a very different place. He's going to be talking about fundamentals of the banking system, real fundamentals of our monetary system. I think you're going to find it very, very interesting. And just to kind of set the scene for this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Violation Tracker. You might remember I mentioned Violation Tracker during the introductory piece. So again, I'm going to share my screen and show you this. Violation Tracker is a US database. I'm very proud to say that we are successfully developing a violation tracker for the UK. It's going to be launched within the next month or so. And we hope to help Violation Tracker to become globalized. So maybe one day there'll be a Violation Tracker in Australia, who knows? So the reason I'm showing you this is because what you can do with this Violation Tracker database is you can search it in many different ways. If you search it by industry totals, you get to the harsh, shocking reality that of all the 50, I think it is, 51 industries categorized, the one that breaks the rules most, that's fined the most, is the financial services sector. A huge $333 billion worth of infringements against the financial services sector. Just to put that into context, that equates to 50% of the sum total. In other words, if you put financial services at the one end of the scales and all of these other industries at the other end of the scales, it equates to about the same, which does really speak to the idea that there is something grotesquely wrong with conduct within the financial services sector. I know this is a US database, but I guess the pattern may be repeated elsewhere. And if you click onto the bit of detail, what you find, ladies and gentlemen, is the same banks getting caught doing the same things over and over again. They get caught, they get fined, they carry on. They get caught, they get fined, they carry on. They get caught, they get fined, they carry on. Toxic securities abuses, banking violations, insider trading, anti-money laundering deficiencies, False Claims Act related activities, mortgage abuses, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, investor protection violations, etc., etc., etc. So this really does speak to the idea, ladies and gentlemen, that there's something profoundly wrong with the banking sector in terms of its conduct, but also the idea that if you fine them, they'll stop doing it. That doesn't seem to be working at all. That really doesn't seem to be working at all. So we're now going to be hearing some thoughts about this and related matters from Bernard Thomson. Can I please, first of all, please invite you all to show your appreciation for Bernard for preparing and delivering the session he's about to deliver.
Now, this has been developed over a period, and I'm glad, Andy, that you mentioned that I'm taking a different position in approaching this question, but it's not completely different because, as Andy mentioned right at the beginning, the curiosity and the particular problem with financial matters is that finance is not about stuff. It's about concepts, as he put it. And that's a little bit what I want to explore. And I must say, initially, when I was just thinking about what I'd be saying, I thought I'm sitting in front of some very erudite and experienced people. And what I'm going to put forward is not the result of what I might call professional erudition, but more a sort of imaginative exploration. So I ask you to suspend your erudition while you follow this thought process. So, and I'm very keen also, if you want to give me any feedback of any sort, critical or otherwise, I like to learn from what I do, so please do. So I mentioned Economic Reform Australia and Rethinking Economics, that I'm most involved with, that you can also have a look at. So what's the purpose of the financial system? Now, I'm saying in the beginning, before accounting and money, prehistoric tribal communities attributed roles to their members according to which the tasks and responsibilities were allocated and the available resources distributed. It was understood that human beings owed their existence to an all-creative world and any transgression within the tribe was also an offence against the world order, thus disturbing the relationship. Often a sacrifice of some kind would be required as a means of restoring the relationship and absolving the offender and the whole community of the debt incurred. In later times of great civilizations, the ordering of social life was prescribed by the theocratic rulership. Here too, remedies were required for offences which might undermine social cohesion, as the primary concern was to maintain a stable social order. Later on, now I call it from accounting to money. The economic life of early civilizations was guided by the obligations and entitlements of the various social classes. Early money was essentially a record of the agreements between creditors and debtors. And in fact, the first script was accounting, not poetry or stories or whatever. It was really about accounting. So accounting records in cuneiform script have been found in ancient temple sites dating back to the middle of the 4th millennium BC. The sanctity of the agreements were maintained and enforced under the theocratic rulership of the day. So what was owed by the farmers or the traders or whatever to the rulership, to the temples or the pharaoh, was all recorded, and then everyone knew where they stood with each other, so to speak. Now, money as we think of it, in terms of coins or bits or items, the first coins that are known of that had that kind of inscription on them were minted by the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus around 600 BC. I came across this purely by chance many years ago. I was looking something up in an encyclopedia, and I thought, this is really interesting, because on the coin was the statement or the words written, "I am the sign of the bright one." So my authority comes from the bright one, and it's now put into a coin. Of course, it's associated with the temple. The temple was the place where coins were issued. The original, as I've said, the original coin issuing authority belonged to the sacred rites of the temple. Over time, this authority was transferred from gods to emperors and kings, and finally to Reserve Bank governors and their, should say, masters. The word money derives from moneta, a name given to the Roman goddess Juno, in whose temple Roman coins were minted. Money as coin sets up a new possibility as a transferable contract, fungibility, authorized by the issuer. Any person in possession of coins is now in a position to exercise the claim commensurate with the market value on the coins. So understand, coins are an expression of that contract. They confer entitlement on the person who possesses them. And of course, great freedom comes about, whereas previously with the accounting records, they were in a sense personal between the authority and the individual, and they weren't necessarily transferable. You couldn't remove yourself of your obligations, only subject to certain conditions. So I've modified my presentation a bit, but doing God's work, some of you may remember a statement by Lloyd Blankfein, who should pop up here, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who claims the banks do God's work. And I think he was being completely sincere. He wasn't trying to be funny. And I thought, what an interesting statement, because it sort of links with money and the temple. But what does he mean? We'll see where this goes now. And of course, the temple is, the bank, of course, has the image, as do all sort of legal, if you like, or official buildings, have a sort of temple status about them. And of course, the temple became the bank. And the banks, as we see there, they've got this halo around them because they're doing God's work. Now, we know that the bank, of course, is the bank, or its financial institution, is a very significant part of our society, because it's the means by which we direct or allocate entitlement. So when the loan is made into the real economy, people are mobilized, resources are mobilized to do stuff. And then, of course, the feedback goes, if you like, back to the bank. So the money is not, as we know, a thing like what's done in the real economy, but it interacts with it in a very special way, and it makes things possible that would otherwise be very difficult if you had to resort to unique relationships between one party and another. I point out that government expenditure is almost tantamount to a requisition of goods and services at market price. And we know that banks or governments like the Australian government have no limit to what they can command, subject to the rules they declare. Only it must be, as long as it's available in the market, they can say, we'll have that bridge, we'll build that railway or whatever. Private sector, when they go spending, don't have quite the same directive power, but of course it's very persuasive. But all the time, it's the one with the money who can make the claim. Now, here's the financial sector. So we've had investing in the real economy, mobilizing activity. Now, when the banks or the financial sector invests in itself, something peculiar happens, of course. They all get excited because all this speculative bubble that they're participating in, and the returns go back to, I mean, this is like feeding itself. It's a kind of cancer, really. And then it goes back to the system. It just cycles around. And we know why has trillions have been spent into world economies, and share prices have boomed and banking has boomed. So moving on from there. So I kind of want to illustrate a little bit that about the financial services. There are legitimate financial services, I would call them, namely allocating claim. And then, of course, what we call derivatives, stuff we sort of, we just imagine, and there's no end to human imagination to conjure up contracts that can be speculated against, that no one really understands what they're talking about anymore. So my question to that is this really serving the economy? And why do we allow it, even if it's not? I mean, the big argument for finance is it efficiently allocates capital. It's kind of good for us. That's why we need it. They say, well, do we really need all this? And why do we allow it? I suggest we allow it because we haven't quite got hold of it properly in our thinking. And we treat it as though it was another commodity. And then I think there's what Andy was just mentioning, the various fines given to US financial institutions. So who's being served by the financial sector? Moving on. Yeah, on debt and forgiveness, it becomes clear when we examine the money cycle that while goods and services are consumed or completed, money remains constant or even increases when interest is applied. The consequence of this ever increasing financial pressure is to inflate prices, especially in land, stocks and shares. The expanding debt burden forces us to keep accelerating economic production in a futile effort to catch up and repay our debts. It is not for no reason that usury was widely condemned in earlier times. Aristotle deemed it unnatural that money should beget money in a way similar to cattle producing calves. So what's to be done? Let us remember that just as money is created out of thin air, it can and must also be removed and destroyed to reverse social indebtedness. I suggest three methods, and as a sort of ideas. Taxation, of course, destroys money if it's taxing back to the money issuing authority. Central government spending, the funding of education, social, health and welfare services and so on, is akin to gifting back into the economy. And debt cancellation or forgiveness in the form of debt jubilee, although we can't quite get our heads around it, we can certainly do it when the banks need their debts, their toxic debts extinguishing. And a lot of that happened, of course, after 2008. Now, I had this interesting experience, which for me was a bit thought-provoking, and this happened quite a few years ago in the UK. I was staying with my father, the freezer had broken, we decided we'd need to order another one. So I get onto the website, find Currys, and that was one event I was involved in. The other was transferring money back to Australia. Both kind of transaction type things. So there's the Currys type process. And then the freezer comes back. We all know it's very straightforward transaction. And the banking one was a kind of, looks like it's a bit comparable. Pounds go from UK bank, turn up in Ausbank, and that's that. Now, I can't quite see all my screens, so I have to move this thing out. Oops, sorry. I contrasted the two processes. The freezer, which took in the end 6 weeks, it was a torturous process, phone calls to check, all sorts of fuss and hassle, and it had to come from Germany and the warehouse hadn't found it or whatever. It was just an ongoing pain in the neck. There's a bit of a picture of what's involved with this freezer coming from a German warehouse to a UK address. Of course, it's manufactured, I discovered, in Thailand, gets transported probably in a container to maybe it's Hamburg, somewhere in Germany, and then it goes to a warehouse, then it gets distributed. So it's a big deal. There's a lot of steps, and there's people involved, there's stuff involved, there's energy, it's a physical process, as well as contracts, etc. So when we put it in a picture, which should pop up now, oops, it's not popping up. Oh, don't know why that is. Oh, yeah, there's the freezer. There's the roads from Germany to the ports, onto the ship, off the ship, on the truck. There's our house, and there's the shortcut. So you just have to say, we all know that, a lot of stuff happens, real world stuff. Now, let's look at the money one. This was on a Sunday evening. I thought, I'll try and set up some bank transfer process. You can do this at any day of the week, any time of the day. This was a Sunday evening, about 8 o'clock. I create an account with UK Forex. Of course, they don't care what time you do it. 10 minutes later, we get a phone call, Sunday evening. Very clear, very smart voice. I thought, this is really simple. This is fantastic. And he checks that everything's in order. Yep, fine, fine. Very simple to understand. It was so seamless and transparent. I thought, this is brilliant. Fill in the details, and it's fairly straightforward. You put the bank details in, etc. So did all that. Then comes another phone call. It's maybe 9:15. Just confirming that the details were right. Yes, yes, yes. All fine. Boom. So, and I was thinking, there's a freezer and this. This is so different. And it was pleasurable to see how sort of easy this was. And why was it so easy? Because there was no stuff moving, no one in dungarees pushing a trolley, nothing. It was all just facilitated through technology. It was an information exchange. That's what was going on. And of course, they took their clip in it. So the two examples cited illustrate a stark difference between the purchase of a good and a purely financial transfer. In the latter case, ownership of a financial asset, certificate of claim, is transferred and the result recorded in another currency. Money can only purchase commodities, goods or services, And money itself cannot be a legitimate commodity as it has none of the attributes of a commodity. It's not produced, cannot be consumed, and does not wear out. Treating money as a commodity leads not just to misunderstanding the financial system, deeming it to be an industry, but also the inevitable abuses that we currently experience. And I know we get so used to this talk of, I had a friend who worked in a bank and he'd talk about financial products. And I thought, oh, what do they look like? You know, they're heavy? What are you talking about? It's unnatural to use that language, but we've, I think, had our minds washed through with terminology that misleads us. So what's a product? There's the Oxford English Dictionary, a thing that is grown, produced, or created, usually for sale. What are classed as financial products? These are basically contracts with financial institutions that help you to save, invest, get insurance, or borrow money. These basic contracts have been vastly expanded to include a bewildering array of financial derivatives whose value derive in principle from the values of underlying assets. There may, however, be any number of intermediary links to any real asset. And I know for a normal person like me gets perplexed when we hear that things like the economy is suffering and the share market goes up. Well, why does the share market go up? Well, because they're expecting the government to inject funds. So it's just bizarre what might happen. And it has not, it's so far removed from reality, but it's allowed. It's allowed. And that's, I think, the problem. It's not just how do we make people behave better, but why do we allow some things to exist at all? So rethinking money as a social contract. You might be familiar with that statement of Kenneth Galbraith. The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled. Once we recognize that financial products are actually financial contracts, the mind need no longer be repelled. Just replace money with social contract and create it with greed. Contracts acquire their substance or efficacy solely by virtue of legislation, regulations, and agreements. As contracts, they clearly do not meet a commonplace definition of a product. And the economist Carl Polanyi, I think, has got a lot of interesting things to say, called it a fictitious commodity, along with labour and land. So, to achieve transparency means exposing otherwise concealed or obscure facts. Transparency alone is, however, not of itself adequate to the task of remedying the malpractices currently taking place. In addition, we must properly interpret the facts to ensure a correct diagnosis, which can inform appropriate legislative and regulatory remedies. As a first step, we can begin with correctly labelling the practices of the financial system and finance sector. The use of vague and misleading terms stands in the way of a clear vision for action. Let us begin by replacing the term financial product with financial service, the result of which is either advice or a contract, not a product. In conclusion, let us talk about banking services, not banking industry. Then we can discuss what is genuinely a service, as opposed to a speculative gamble designed to benefit the financial institution. When the interests of society as a whole define the purpose of the finance system, then its scope will be properly limited to that end. And I think the point, it's probably Andy that made it, that a separate institution needs to address the financial sector, not the same as addresses other business areas, if you like, is absolutely right, because it needs different language, a whole different way of thinking. So some notes, just a few ideas. We hear money works for you, money is wealth, finance industry, insurance products, wealth management. Money is not wealth, as we know. I did a workshop once where I took a load of Japanese war dollars with me, $100 bills. I had about 50 of them. Are they money? Well, they were once, not anymore. They're not worth anything. And financial markets what do we mean financial markets? We sort of mislead ourselves when we don't think, when we think of money as a commodity that can be traded, and it's part of the problem. So there was, this is just an interesting little thing I came across. A book or a committee was busy with the question of money. We believe that the existing system of debt finance, whereby practically all money comes into circulation as interest-bearing debt, is prejudicial to human well-being. A drag on the development and distribution of wealth, finds no justification in the nature of things, and perpetuates a wrong conception of the function of money in human society. I won't perhaps say more than that. I think it might seem a bit off track, so to speak, but the more I witness and hear about, the more I think, well, hang on. And I mean, Andy's obviously trying to do some really good work, Andy Schmulow now I'm thinking of. But my feeling is, unless we corral or determine really clearly the size of the sandpit that the financial sector can legitimately occupy, it will misbehave. It's almost invited to misbehave because human beings are creative and they've also got self-interest, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if it can just expand exponentially, because money costs nothing to create, it's keyboard strokes. And I'm a bit skeptical about people just learning to behave better, because really the people in the finance world are behaving exactly how the system has been designed. They're doing the right thing. Shareholders, all the rest of it, they're not misbehaving. I mean, some have, there's been illegality, but a lot of self-interest is purely, well, it's the market. And there was an interesting question put by Ellie, I think, about would other currencies, like the marketplace brings about competition, and then we kind of behave better because there's someone else doing something. My feeling is that would lead to more, what would you call it, cowboy territory, just be Wild West. And people would suddenly find they've got a currency that's not worth anything, is speculated against, etc., etc. So there you have it. So please do give me any thoughts or reflections or questions if you like.
Bernard, thank you very much indeed. I found that extremely interesting. I hope everybody else did as well. You've really invited us to think about some of the absolute fundamentals in the financial ecosystem. In a moment, I'm going to go to Shan Turnbull, because I noticed Shan nodding away a moment or two ago in relation to some of the points that you were making. But just before we go to Shan, and then, of course, anybody else after, I speak to a lot of people around the world. We've got members in 21 countries. And one of the recurring themes that's coming up time after time after time is a very real worry about the financialization of the entire system, which I think you're speaking to, Bernard. You're speaking to this concern that because money can be created with a few keyboard strokes, and because of the way that money is being used to deal with massive problems such as the pandemic and how we responded to the global financial crisis, I speak to a lot of people around the world who are genuinely concerned that the finance industry is becoming disproportionately significant. And as you touched on just now, there doesn't seem to be anything in the system that's going to keep that in check. So where's it all going to go is kind of where my thoughts are. Mr. Shan Turnbull, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself and share any reflections you'd like to make on what Bernard has been saying. And of course, feel free to add in one or two of your own. I'm sure you will. Thank you, Shan.
Well, just pull me up when I get carried away. But Bernard's brought us back to earth, which it's marvelous. And if you look in the chat session, I said money is not fit for purpose. It's too complicated. It carries out functions which it shouldn't do. And the basic function we want, I think Bernard said it in his presentation, it's useful for exchange and a medium of exchange, but it shouldn't be a store of value, and it shouldn't be a unit of account. And it's not a unit of account. The International Accounting Standards Board has all these marvelous standards for accounting, but they haven't defined what economic value is. And in nature and in primitive societies, they didn't have a word for economic value. It wasn't relevant for allocating real resources. Real resources were allocated by relationships, and you didn't need money to do that. And you get self-governing in nature. Every complexity is self-regulating, self-managing, and self-governing. Now, the financial system is a belief system. And I think Dr. Andy said that at the very beginning. He said it's just a social relationships, and it's so complicated, complex, and you cannot control, manage, or understand complexity top down. And that's what he's talking about, having regulators of regulators, where what you want is empower the people at the bottom to be self-regulating like nature is. And my proposal is that we should use the money in the Great Depression, which was self-liquidating. You didn't need because central banks failed. The Federal Reserve failed to be a reserve bank. Thousands of communities created their own money. And that's what we should be doing. We should have decentralized money, which is a medium of exchange. It's the way the government could counter. Cryptocurrencies just reveal how ridiculous modern money is. It's not tethered to anything. If a tether was established, it doesn't have to be the government. Somebody established a recognized tether of value, and value is sustaining life on Earth. And to sustain life on Earth, we need energy. So one commodity would be renewable energy that can last eternally. And if you want eternal life on Earth, you've got to stop burning carbon and just have money which is connected to sustainability. Or you could have a sustainability index, which is simply you tether the value of your money to the percentage of renewable energy used in that region. And so people that burn carbon would have a very cheap money because nobody could live in that region for eternity. So those regions which had the most natural resources and human-created resources would survive and the others wouldn't. So I could ramble on and on and on, but we're doing it the wrong way, top down. I think Bernard's made a great contribution saying we've got to go bottom up, go back and ask the funder, if you want transparency, we've got to stop using words which are lies, like making a deposit. You don't deposit anything in a bank nowadays. It used to be, but we've captured by these mental models of putting something on deposit. It's not. It's just, as Bernard said, it's just a social contract. And it's a contract which is not fit for purpose because there's no definition of what its value is. You get tweets from Trump and suddenly the exchange rates change by 10%. It's not a way of promoting business if you don't have reliable, constant, reliable unit of value or standards. We don't have standards of value. It's just a ridiculous make-believe world, and it's too complicated to control, certainly from the top down. So I think I've said enough, haven't I, Andy?
You always say just about the right amount, Shan. Very good.
Oh, you smooth talking silver tongue. you could say it much better for me. I just wish you could take over and make these presentations rather than get me involved.
You make me laugh. You make me laugh. I saw Stephen Hubbard nodding his head away a moment ago. So we'll go to Stephen shortly. But first of all, Harry Chime has put his hand up. Harry, you'd like to speak? Go for it. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, look, thank you so much for that presentation, Bernard. Really appreciated it. Look, I often just go back to this saying that Warren Buffett's partner actually came up with, Charlie Munger: show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. And it does drive a lot in financial services, fortunately or otherwise. And I kind of look at, I'll give you two quick examples. So one, let's look at the Scottish Enlightenment. And they came up with the concept of how do we keep widows who've survived the death of their partners in mines and so forth alive and not subject to poverty. And from that came the concept of a pension fund, a little stipend for widows so that they and their kids could survive. And that's turned out to be a social good. I think we can generally agree. And that's spun up the pension systems around the world, Germany, Weimar, Australia, blah, blah, blah. And here we are 100 and whatever years later. And we have you've got the ability to smooth your consumption through time so that you can put away a little bit and have a reasonable standard of living. I think where it sort of went off the rails for mine is this US model that skewed the incentives. So there was a time when individuals, if they wanted to run a financial services organization, they literally put their necks on the line. It was a partnership, and you collectively got together with other partners and you took risks. And if it didn't work out, you wore those risks. You wore those risks in your personal wealth. You wore those risks in your reputation, which was everything back then. And something weird happened in the 70s and the 80s. And a particular investment bank called Solomon Brothers said, you know what, let's just go private. Let's just go public. Let's stop being a partnership and let's go public. Now that skews the incentives massively, because then what happens is you have an executive class which are massively incentivized to push up the share price because they benefit. Of course, they know things that the investing public or investors or deposit holders don't. And so you get this massive asymmetry forming. And from that, I guess all we have to do is really look at AMP. 140, 150 years, you know, a proud Australian institution, own Henderson's in the UK, massive alignment between effectively the holders, not shareholders, but effectively the members and the executive. And the moment that broke down in '98, and I saw that because I was part of an institution that helped with that listing, it's just gone all terribly, terribly pear-shaped. So I kind of hold AMP as the yardstick of sort of how the system can break down when those incentives start to get misaligned.
Harry, that's so interesting to me. I worked for AMP in the UK for several years. I helped to build the kind of the sales force for AMP in the UK many years ago. And I can honestly tell you, this is when it was a mutual still. The culture was lovely. It was generally very paternalistic. Every decision made was based around what's good for the member. And to learn what's happened to AMP since then is just absolutely shocking. You know, what's been happening to AMP in recent years would have been inconceivable 20 years ago, in my personal opinion. And I think you've hit on a really important point here. The way that an organization is owned is such a big driver of how it behaves. And you're right, we have somehow allowed society to enable organizations to exist where there's no correlation between ownership and responsibility. Yeah, to my mind, if I own a gun, I'm responsible for that gun. Yeah, if I drive a car, I'm responsible for what that car does on the road. What we've now got is a situation where once upon a time, if you owned a business, or you were one of many people who collectively owned a business by way of a partnership, you owned the asset, the business, but you were also responsible for it. What we seem to have now, Harry, in my mind, is a massive break in the link between ownership and responsibility. Today, you can own something by way of it being publicly listed, etc., but you carry no real personal responsibility at all. And even the executive can walk away from the consequences of their decisions because everything's so short-termist. And we all know that sometimes businesses and boards make short-term decisions to enrich themselves at the expense of the organization they're running, several years down the road. I think you've hit on a massive point. I wonder, though, I really worry about how on earth can that be re-engineered? Can we ever go back? Have we got like a one-way valve in the system? Have we gone past a point of no return? Or will there eventually be some realization that if we carry on as we are, we're going to end up with so many massive systemic and social problems that I hope we'll get to a point where people will realize something significant needs to change. Harry, you've opened up a treasure chest of thinking there. Do you want to reflect on any of that? And then we'll go to Stephen Hubbard. Thank you, Harry.
I'll just say one last thing and then over to Stephen. I think the only thing that gets us partly back that way is probably SMCR and bear type regimes, where you make the executives once again highly accountable for their decisions, the decisions at the shareholder levels, even the decisions at the societal level. You do that and you don't get back to the partnership model, but you move the dial back a little bit.
Thank you, Harry. I found that very interesting indeed. Mr. Stephen Hubbard, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself and your firm, then share your point with us. Thank you, Stephen.
Look, thanks very much, Andy, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I'm an independent advisor and consultant, and my main focus is on superannuation retirement. And anybody that comes across my stuff on social media will see that I'm always saying superannuation is not super yet. And there's a lot more we can do to make it better. And Andy, I'll reach out separately around that white paper you talked about, because I've written quite a lot on that, and I'll share some of that with you. I know Harry and I have chatted many times, and the concept of vested interest and follow the money comes up an awful lot. And to try and get my thoughts together, there's so much in what I've heard today that I'd love to talk to. And I know it's 20 to 8 here in Melbourne, so we don't want to go on too long. The concept of ownership, I think, is one of the things I want to talk about, and the conflicts that go on within organisations. And to your point, Andy, I think whether it's the point of no return, but we're not going to be able to undo. We're not going to be able to put the toothpaste back in the tube. However, what we need to do is to recognise the tensions and the conflicts that exist, and look at what we can do to manage them. If I look at the superannuation industry, which is the area I know best, we've got some real conflicts and real tensions going on, both in the profit for members sector. So that might look a bit like the old mutuals. And I spent 10 years working at Colonial Mutual Life Assurance Society. The first 5 years was as a mutual, and the second 5 year was post demutualisation. And I've certainly had first-hand experience at the different cultures. And Andy, you talked about the delight of working in a mutual, and I can look back on my 5 years, and in fact, I still see a lot of people that I worked with back then, and even still there's a sense of family among the ex-staff that worked at Colonial Mutual pre-demutualisation, and the life at Colonial since demutualisation was dramatically different. So getting back to, I think about here in Australia, we have two main classifications of superannuation fund, and I'll ignore the self-managed super funds for this purpose. We've got the retail funds, which are typically owned by shareholder-owned organisations, and then we've got the profit for members superannuation funds, which are industry funds, corporate funds, owned and public sector funds. And it's really interesting, and I think some of the questions about ownership, we can actually learn a lot from the way these organisations work or don't work for the. And one of the big highlights of the Royal Commission for many was the superannuation funds being questioned by Hayne about the conflict between shareholder interest and member interest. And we've just saw just this week a fine to CBA coming out of it by ASIC around that very conflict. And I'm actually doing some expert opinion work on a couple of law class actions that are that have come out of the Royal Commission, and it's fascinating. And I won't talk too much about it, but there's certain stuff I can talk about. And when you get to see, and one of those class actions that I'm an expert witness, I got to see hundreds and hundreds of documents, including emails between staff and board minutes and all that sort of stuff. And it's given me some really interesting insights into that conflict that goes on between the shareholder trying to make profit for the shareholder, so the corporate board or the corporate trying to make profit for the shareholders on one hand, but then you've got a separate entity, the trustee board of the superannuation fund, that should be looking after the members' best interest. And how can one organisation do both? And a lot of people might look at the industry funds and say, well, they don't have that conflict. And that might be true. But then from a commercial, from a technology point of view, from a leading practice point of view, they often don't have the best they could, because their boards are set up around members' best interest and the fiduciary duty. And I think to the point that Andy talked about earlier, the Corporations Act is so big, the super funds have to deal with the Corporations Act as well as the Superannuation Industry Supervision Act, the SIS Act, and all the other stuff that goes with it. So how can one board be able to manage all of that? And I think that's a big issue. And whether principle based will get there or not, I'm not sure. But that ownership structure, looking at the various structures that we have in the superannuation industry, which ones work, which ones don't work. There's a lot of benefits around the non-for-profit or the profit for members structure, but that's also got its limitations. When they don't have that same, and it's a real balance of how important profit is. because it can lead to bad practices, laziness if you don't have that. So how does one get that sort of commercial, proper, when we talk about doing things in the member's best interest, it's not just warm and fuzzy. How do you make it real? So there's sort of some reflections I've got initially. I'm going to go away. You've given me a lot to think about, all the speakers, and there's actually a lot I want to think about and write about coming out of this. But I think maybe we have gone past the point of no return, and we've got to think about what we can do with what we have rather than wishing about what we had.
That's a nice way of looking at it. Let's think about what we can do with what we've got. I like that. That sounds pretty positive and pretty constructive to me. Thanks, Stephen. That was very interesting indeed. I'm going to change my view to gallery view so I can see all of you in little thumbnails. Please wave at me if you'd like to say something. Mr. Nicholas Morris, you're never going to come to one of my sessions without saying something. So, Nicholas, anything you'd like to say? We're going to go to anybody else that would like to raise their hand and make a point now. For example, Mr. Paul Rogers, would you like to say anything, or anybody else? Paul, anything from you, sir? Paul Rogers?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I got a squeaky chair. You can hear me all right? Yes,
yes we can.
Yeah. So, yeah, the conversation is really interesting. I've known Harry for a long time and I bumped into Stephen along the way. And the industry has changed dramatically. And even so, I've been working in the industry for 35, 40 years. And when I first started, Melbourne as a place was a lot of manufacturing, and financial services was quite small. And at that time, when I first started, I started in chartered accounting, I thought, how is Melbourne going to survive as manufacturing moves out? What's going to happen here? And we talk about really what's happened, and it's happened globally. And I put a note in the chat. Why is financial services becoming big? It's because people need stuff to do. We're all getting a lot smarter, so we just think of stuff. We're very good. Human beings have great imaginations. We imagine so many things. Our cat and our dog don't imagine things like we do. We're unbelievably good at it. So we are creating these unique things to keep ourselves entertained and intellectually stimulated. We used to have 20 farmers. We've got one farmer now because tractors and technologies moved along. And this is going to continue. We have got automation. Automation is going to take manual jobs. That's going away. We're going to have more educated people coming up with outlandish ideas. And financial services is a great place to do it because it's all theoretical. There's no reality going on here at all. So how do we control that? One of the problems with Andy, our first speaker, was I love a principle-based system, but I've worked in a big four bank in Australia, and ethics is an interesting concept, but profit is important. I was listening, there was relayed to me a conversation, a senior executive running a department. He said 20% of the conversation at year end was on where how well your department went profitability if you outperformed budget. But if you underperformed budget, it was 100% of the conversation. So that gets back to Harry's point about incentives. And superannuation funds own the assets that the directors have got to get. The super fund has got a Section 51. You've got to maximise the outcome for the members. How do you do that? You buy shares, you put pressure on the directors, you put pressure on the staff to improve profitability and get the share price up. We've created a circle for ourselves. Their own fault.
I think you might be right there. I really do think you might be spot on there. Mr. Paul Rogers, thank you very much. We're going to move briefly to Peter Hanlon. Peter, you put yourself forward for one of the just a minute rounds. Stephen had his earlier. Peter, within a minute or so, please summarise what else you'd like to share, and then we'll start bringing the session to a close. Mr. Peter Hanlon, thank you.
Well, maybe just quickly, 10, 20 seconds on the proliferation on banks, Andy. There are some obvious reasons, capital ratios and ball ratios, and also credit expansion. 201% credit in Australia versus 50% 20 years ago. So the whole balance sheets get valued on that basis. But my issue really, which I don't know the answer to, is disenfranchisement of banking services by so many of the population now, Andy, with basically responsible lending here is killing small business people in the rest. You've got individual pricing of mortgages, which are hurting them. You've got credit scores, and you've got also access to a bank. So at some point in time, we're going to have 30% of the population with the payday lenders and kneecappers, and we have some payday lenders here. When you compound it up, Andy, they're 500% an annual, which is unbelievable. And then you've got afterpay, before pay now. I just think there has to be some reining in on the way credit and the way access is being done through an improved supervisory protocols and supervisory framework. And otherwise, we're going to have a real failure of banking service provision, Andy. I'll stop there, okay?
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Very thought-provoking as always. Would anybody else like to make a point before we start bringing the session to a close? Just wave a hand at me, either digitally or otherwise. Harry, back to you, sir.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on what Paul said, and g'day, Paul. And it's right. As a Melburnian, I remember when I moved here, it was very manufacturing heavy, and we've lost that. And I should make the point now that Australia is it's a weird combination of Switzerland, but with a big mine, because believe it or not, there's 450,000 people employed in financial services in Australia. It is the biggest, if not the biggest, the second biggest employer, even though a lot of our trade obviously is done through shoveling bits of coal off to China. So that's a quandary, right? It is a significant part of our GDP now, and how do you deal with that? As I suspect, with superannuation, to pick up on Stephen's point, we probably don't need 150 super funds in Australia. We really don't. And as some of these start to merge, what does that mean? We effectively, what I'm saying is that probably a lot of people in financial services that probably should sort of ask themselves what value that they're really providing from a societal, bigger picture point of view.
I think that's a very honest point to make. So much of this seems to be about moving money around from one place to another, then back again in various different forms, isn't it? And what real added value is some of the financial ecosystem actually creating? Really interesting stuff, ladies and gentlemen. It's been great. Well, I've enjoyed it anyway, and I've certainly picked up a lot of thoughts and ideas from all of our speakers and all of our contributors. Can we please take a moment to thank Bernard for his session? Bernard, that was very interesting indeed. Thank you very much indeed for delivering it and preparing it. It's been a pleasure to get to know you over a while. Bernard, please do share.
Can I conclude with just one word? One thing I think is always worth remembering. It was, yes, we can't go back, but we can unravel wrong thinking, but it takes effort. If we imagine banks or financial institutions have a license, and they have a very special license, which allows them to confer on others credit. No one else can do that. They can do it. And I think just if you imagine, if you wanted to work with plutonium, you'd need a very special license with very special conditions. Yeah. We need to think, what should that license allow for, and how will it be described in such a way that it cannot do social harm? That we have to think fundamentals, I think. And when we say, oh, well, it's just the market, the market will sort it out. That's the first problem, wrong thinking. It's a license that's quite unique. And just as it can do great good for society, it allows us to do things, be creative and all the great things, it can cause so much damage. And it's like a cancer now. It's out of control, and the license needs to be reviewed. What are we allowing people, or us creative people, as Paul mentioned? We're brilliant. Well, allow us to do mad things, and we do mad things. So the license needs to be reviewed, and that, I think, need to be reviewed on the basis of clear thinking and what is socially is conducive to social well-being. We've got to stop the damage that's being done. under the guise or the pretense of, well, it's creating, value. And I just see now that the City of London, they're looking at reducing the tax on profits because it's so important. Well, what's it doing? It's not growing food. It's not housing people. It's not, so we need to be brutal with our thinking about this. So that's my last appeal, really.
I think that's an excellent way to bring the session to a close. I really do, Harry. Bernard, you've outlined some key points there, and it ties into something Stephen put in the chat. He mentioned before pay is very concerning, and I don't know much about before pay, but the little I do know makes me think that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to end up getting addicted to debt and addicted to debt cycles, and that's only going to end in misery, isn't it, for a lot of people, I'm sure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me today. I've really enjoyed the session. I've picked up a lot of great ideas and thoughts and insights from many of you. I really do appreciate that. We will, just to cover off the sort of housekeeping, we'll be circulating the slides, we'll circulate the chat, we'll add you to our Transparency Times newsletter if you're not already on it. One of the links in the chat that you'll get tomorrow is to our different groups. So if you have a particular interest, for example, in pensions or investments or banks, then you can select which TTF groups to get into. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure to host the session today. I hope you've all found it of value in some way. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, guys and girls.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye all. Bye-bye. Thank you.